Okay, let us try. Okay. So first, I'm going to start by paying homage to the Buddha in the traditional way. 3 times. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Okay, first I have to say that it's a great honor to have been invited to this first chanting of the Pali Tipitaka being held in the United States, and then being invited to give the talk on the first evening of the recitation. And so we had a very full and uplifting day today. But I hope I can sustain my energy through the rest of the evening. And the reason why I chose the particular topic, the path to liberation in early Buddhism, is because it is this topic which forms, you call the core or substance of a number of the suttas in the first book of the Digha Nikaya, which is called the Sila Khandavagga, which is the chapter or section on the silas, the moralities, or the observances of virtuous behavior. Okay, now it seems to me that the compilers of the Pali Canon had a strategic or logistical purpose. Okay. A strategic or logistical purpose in arranging the sequence of suttas in the Digha Nikaya. They started, as I would formulate the hypothesis, that they started by putting the Brahmajala Sutta in the first position, because this sutta has the particular purpose of clearing away those factors which are particular obstacles to treading the path to liberation. At the time that the Buddha appeared in the world, India was rife with various speculations about the nature of the self and the nature of the world. The thinkers of the Upanishads particularly investigated the inner universe of personal existence, of the mind, seeking our true individual identity. And so they stripped away one layer after another layer after another layer of the empirical person until they claimed to have discovered an imperishable essence at the very core of personal identity, an essence which they called the Atman, the self. And they held that this self is unchanging, universal, substantial, and the same in all living beings. So ultimately, there is one true self underlying the diversity of beings in the world. They also inquired into the ultimate nature of the world itself. And so they stripped away the appearances of the outer world, which they called nama rupa, name and form, and then they have claimed to have discovered an ultimate essence underlying all of the changing phenomena of the world. And this ultimate essence they called Brahman, which might be rendered the absolute. And then the core discovery or the core proclamation of the Upanishads was that the innermost essence of the person or of a living being, the Atman, and the ultimate essence of the world, Brahman, are one and the same. So beneath all of the diversity of individual beings, beneath all the diversity of outer phenomena, there is one all-embracing, all-comprehending, substantial reality, which can be called either Atman, the self, or Brahman, the absolute. Now the Buddha took exactly the opposite approach. Rather than settling upon any kind of substantial underlying essence of the person and of the world, he investigated all of the phenomena of individual identity and all the phenomena of the outer world, and he declared that everything is impermanent, conditioned, arising in dependence on conditions, and for this reason, everything, the Buddha declared, is anatta, non-self. And yet, in order to present his teaching with his ultimate liberating insight into selflessness as the core realization of wisdom, the Buddha had to dispose of this multiplicity of views and speculations that had originated in India and took many different forms. And so the first discourse of the Digha Nikaya, the Brahmajala Sutta, has the function of clearing away this wilderness or jungle of speculative views about the Atman, the true everlasting self, views about an underlying substance to the world, and in this way opening up the field of spiritual inquiry to the possibility of realization of the key elements of the Buddha's teaching, which the Buddha in the Brahmajala Sutta, the first discourse, he states that only very concisely, almost at the end of the sutta, after disposing of all of these views as being products of ignorance and craving, he states that when a bhikkhu, a monk, understands as it really is the arising and passing away of the 6 sense bases, the 6 bases for contact, understands the enjoyment that arises through the senses, understands the danger in attachment to experience through the senses, and then understands the escape or the release from this danger, then he understands that which transcends all these views. And so with this last major declaration in the Brahmajala Sutta, the Buddha lays down the core insight, the core subject for contemplation and realization in his teaching. But in the Brahmajala Sutta itself, he doesn't state the actual path to that realization. The explanation of the path, the sequence, really emerges in the second discourse of the Digha Nikaya, which is called the Discourse on the fruits of the ascetic life or the monastic life, the Samanyapala Sutta. This sutta begins when King Ajatasattu, who was the king of the major North Indian state of Magadha, which now corresponds to Bihar, had been troubled by his conscience because he was a parasite, not a also a parasite, but a patricide. In that he came to the kingship by killing his own father, who is a virtuous king, King Bimbisara, who is one of the Buddha's first supporters and presented the Buddha with the bamboo grove. And so King Ajatasattu was troubled in conscience. It said that he couldn't even sleep at night. And so he asked his advisors, or he told his advisors that he wanted to visit some ascetic who would be able to console him and to clear his conscience. And so each of his ministers recommended one ascetic after another ascetic, and the king was dissatisfied with all of them. And finally, his personal physician, named Jivaka, who was also the personal physician of the Buddha, told him that he should go to visit the Blessed One, the Buddha. And so King Ajatasattu set out with his retinue to visit the Buddha. And when he approached the Buddha, he asked the Buddha whether the Buddha could describe to him any of the fruits or benefits of the life of renunciation. The king said that there are different occupations in the world, and he mentioned the major types of occupation in that period, particularly those he was familiar with, like archers, infantry, cavalry, goldsmiths, silversmiths, all the variety of occupations. And he said that all of them have their benefits. What is the benefit or the blessing of the ascetic life, the life of renunciation? And then the Buddha is going to present to him, to explain to him the benefits of the life of renunciation. But the Buddha begins by laying out what comes to be called within the Buddha's teaching the Anupubasika, which means the gradual training, the step-by-step training. And this process of training, step-by-step training, this we could say is the core of the path to liberation, which figures prominently in the first book of the Digha Nikaya, and then it also appears in a more compressed form in a number of suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya. For example, in sutta number 27, the shorter discourse on the elephant's footprint simile, sutta number 39, the shorter discourse in Asapura, sutta number 51, I forgot the name of it. As one gets older, one's memory starts to fade, so I had made some notes just to refresh my memory so that I don't skip anything important. Okay, so now we can call this gradual step-by-step training that's going to be laid out, I would call this the primary paradigm of the path that dominates throughout the Nikayas. And so I would say that this is, we call this I call it the core teaching of the first book of the Digha Nikaya. And yet this core presentation of the graduated training is set in different contexts in different suttas of this first book. And we find, this is what's particularly interesting in the Digha Nikaya, that I made some inquiry whether the different Nikayas have particular purposes apart, and whether they are distinguished on some other basis than their length. And it seems to me that the particular purpose of the Digha Nikaya is to present the Buddha's teaching as superior to any of the other rival teachings on the Indian scene of this period. And so we see that this path to liberation is laid out in different contexts. Sometimes it's issued as a rejoinder or an alternative to the Brahman's path, which is the path of, basically, of sacrifice. Not necessarily animal sacrifice, but tending the sacrificial fire, making offerings to the fire, with the belief that by making offerings to the fire, by performing the rites and rituals laid out in the Vedas and the Brahmanas, one could accumulate merit which will lead to a rebirth in heaven or to union with Brahma, the deity worshipped by the Brahmins. And so sometimes this path is laid out as the alternative to the Brahman path of sacrifice and ritualistic practices. In other suttas, it's laid out as the alternative to the path followed by the ascetics, the real ascetics of that period, who thought that the way to liberation was through self-mortification, through undertaking long fasts, through tormenting the body by exposing it to extremes of heat and cold, sleeping on thorns at night, and so forth. And so the Buddha lays out this path as one variation of his middle way. And so this path unfolds step by step, and it always begins, whether in the Digha Nikaya or the Majjhima Nikaya, with a statement that the Tathagata arises in the world. And then it continues with the other special qualities of the Buddha. He is the Arahant, the one who's fully purified, Sama Sambuddho, the one who's perfectly enlightened, Vijacharana Sampanno, the one who possesses knowledge, true knowledge and excellent conduct, Sugato, the one who has reached the good or the fortunate one, and so on. And so this statement is laying out what I call the first precondition for the emergence of the gradual step-by-step path to liberation. That is the arising of a Tathagata, a perfectly, fully enlightened one in the world. And sometimes I see this in my mind's eye like the sun arising against the horizon. So it's like the first light of the sun first appears over the horizon, shedding its light over the world, dispelling the darkness. And so this is the Buddha appearing in the world and shedding, even before he's teaching the Dhamma, just through his own Sammasambodhi, already that enlightenment or awakening is extending a light over the world. So we even have this in the statement of the first discourse at the end of the Dhammacakka Sutta, where it says that a great radiance appeared in the world that surpassed the radiance even of the Devas, the gods. Okay, so the first precondition for the laying down of the path is the arising of the Tathagata, the fully enlightened one in the world. The second precondition is stated in the next sentence. He teaches the Dhamma, which is Adi Kalyanam, Majje Kalyanam, pariyosana kalyana. That is, it's good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end. It's possessed of the right meaning or purpose, and possessed of its satang sabhyanjana. That is, it possesses the right meaning, purpose, or principle, and it's expressed through excellent phrasing, excellent formulation. And that not only does he teach the Dhamma, but it's said that he proclaims the pure and complete brahmacharya, that is the spiritual life, which we can call the practical correlate of the Dhamma. The Dhamma as the teaching, the brahmacharya as the practice, the spiritual life. So these two, of course, they always are interwoven, they go together perfectly. So he teaches the Dhamma. So we have here the second condition is the teaching proclamation of the Dhamma. But if the Buddha just proclaims the Dhamma, but nobody hears it, then it's like spreading out jewels in a deserted forest or on a beach where nobody is going to pick them up. So we have now in the next statement that comes in the suttas, whenever the gradual training is presented, is a householder or a householder's, okay, the text comes from a patriarchal period, householder's son, but let us say a householder's son or daughter, hears the Dhamma, and having heard the Dhamma, gains faith or saddha. So there comes the teaching of the Dhamma, like this is like, we have a current of electricity to be transmitted from the source to its destination. You need the electric current to be transmitted, to be sent down along the wire. But then for the electric current to actually reach its destination, there has to be some type of material that can receive the current. And so when the Buddha is going to teach the Dhamma, usually he surveys the mind of the listener, and if it's a group, the minds of the listeners, using his special faculty of reading the minds of others, in order to find out what are the dispositions, interests, aptitudes of the people that he's teaching, so that he can teach the Dhamma in exactly the appropriate way, which will at least help some of the listeners to gain some faith or even insight in understanding or even realization. So the Buddha chooses the appropriate listeners, and it's when the potential disciple hears the Dhamma that there takes place that event of communication, the communication of the Dhamma. And when that communication is striking on fertile soil, then there arises saddha, faith in the teaching. Faith in the Buddha, faith in the Dhamma, in the teaching. And now in the exposition of the graduated training that is laid out in these suttas, the training is going to be laid out as the form of the monastic training, the training of the full brahmacharya, of the full spiritual life. So when the disciple who is being addressed acquires this faith, then they begin to reflect. And they reflect that this life in the household is said to be sambhado, a word which means confining or constricting or crowded. And then the life of renunciation, the life of going forth, is said to be like open space, like open air, where one can move about freely. And then the potential disciple considers that it's difficult for one who lives at home to live the completely perfect, completely purified spiritual life. And so then they decide, let me then give up my circle of relatives, whether large or small, my accumulation of wealth, whether large or small, and go forth into the homeless life, the life of renunciation. Okay, so through this very steady, firm, and strong faith in the Dhamma and in the one who teaches the Dhamma, then the disciple goes forth into homelessness. And having gone forth, one begins by undertaking the training in Sila. And in the first suttas in the Digha Nikaya, we have a very elaborate account of the silas or disciplinary or moral observances undertaken by the disciple. We have this recited, it already comes in the Brahmajala Sutta in relation to the Buddha, the types of observances or moral practices that the Buddha himself observes. In the second discourse, all of these observances are laid out in relation to a disciple. But in the Majjhima Nikaya, we find a more concise presentation of the moral observances. So basically, we could say that they are an expansion of the 10 courses of wholesome action, except that for abstaining from sexual misconduct, there comes the observance of full brahmacharya, that is, full celibacy, and then a number of basic monastic observances. So this forms the foundation of the path to liberation. And so whether what in this presentation that we find is laid out for one who has taken up the life of renunciation, aiming to reach the final goal within this life itself. And so what is explained in this section are the disciplinary observances of a monastic person, one who has gone forth. But whether it's a lay person or a monastic, anyone who wishes to tread the path to liberation has to lay a secure foundation. And that foundation is established by observing the silas, the basic principles of virtuous behavior, of ethical behavior. And so here we have, even for a lay person, the basic foundation would be at minimum the 5 precepts. If one wants to observe a more elaborate account, a more elaborate scheme of moral practices, one could take the 10 courses of wholesome action. Okay, but the basic function of the moral practices here are to regulate conduct of body and of speech. And the reason for this is that the training is eventually going to focus inwardly upon the mind. But in order to purify the mind, one must begin by purifying bodily action and speech, because bodily action and speech are themselves expressions or manifestations of states of mind. That is, they're manifestations of intentions, volitions, determinations. And so, in order to purify the mind, one must start by purifying or controlling, regulating those tendencies of the mind that tend to break out in the form of unwholesome bodily action, unwholesome speech. And so one begins by abstaining from killing and violently harming other living beings, abstaining from taking what is not given, and then in the monastic presence, by abstaining from any type of sexual activity. So those are the three basic observances of body. Then in speech, abstaining from false speech, slanderous or divisive speech, harsh speech, and then gossip or idle chatter. Okay, so then once one establishes a firm foundation of moral behavior, what is mentioned next in the sequence is contentment. And so it's said that the disciple becomes content with the minimal requirements. In the time of the Buddha, what the Buddha mentions is the disciple should be satisfied with, in this particular passage that comes in the suttas, one has robes to cover the body, and one has an alms bowl to collect one's alms food, in an iPhone to receive messages. I'm sorry. So while he's walking around. No, but the Buddha compares the disciple who is satisfied with robes to cover the body and with alms food to sustain the body. He compares this to a bird which travels around everywhere. Wherever it goes, all it needs is its two wings. So if it wants to live, okay, during the summer, it can live in Canada, and it has its two wings. When the fall arrives and the cold weather is coming, it takes off to Florida or to South Central America. So it doesn't have to, like, I come here, I have for 3 weeks in California, I have a suitcase, and a handbag, this handbag. There are other things in the Berkeley Buddhist Monastery, and a computer, of course. But bird doesn't need to check any luggage. It just takes its two wings and flies off. And then it's happy wherever it is, Florida, South America, North America, New York State, Canada. Everything is complete with its two wings. And so this contentment is a way of stilling, you could say, or quieting down the urges of craving. Of course, you know, from the first discourse of the Buddha says that what's the origin or cause of suffering? It's craving. And craving takes 10,000 different forms. I want this, I need that, I can't get along with this, why don't I have this? And so one begins to build up all of these ideas of these things that one needs to be content. But to find real contentment, it's not a matter of satisfying the desire for this, desire for that, but learning to be happy with just the basic necessities that one requires in order to subsist, in order to undertake this particular training that's going to lead to the uprooting of all of the unwholesome mental states from the mind. Okay, so the second aspect of the training is this contentment. And the Buddha says that one who is observing this code of moral practices and this contentment begins to experience within himself the bliss of blamelessness. That is a bliss which is blameless. So one starts to feel an inner happiness, a happiness that starts swelling up from within when one realizes that one is now purifying one's behavior and one is content with the simplest requisites. So wherever one is, whatever one is doing, one could feel perfectly complete within oneself. But still, there are other stages of the training to follow upon this. And now the training is going to be moving from the outer domain, the domain of action in the world, towards the inner domain, the domain of understanding the mind, training the mind, and liberating the mind. And the next steps in the graduated step-by-step training form a kind of bridge between the sphere of action in the world and the sphere or domain of inner mental purification. Okay, the first part of the bridge, you know, if you've ever traveled across a bridge, one of these large bridges, like we have the Bay Bridge here. Was it called the Oakland Bridge or the Bay Bridge? Yeah. There's part of the bridge which is still on one side of the land, part of the bridge which is going over the water, and the other part of the bridge which is already on the other side of the bay. Okay, so the first part of the bridge, so to speak, is called restraint of the senses, because discontent arises when the senses are moving outward and start grasping upon objects through the senses. And so we're always exposed to visible forms, sounds, delightful, agreeable sounds, odors, tastes, tactile sensations, and then thoughts in the mind, mental images, fantasies, the whole stream of mental objects that are always passing through the mind. And what normally happens when we're not undertaking a process of training is that the mind swings back and forth between two poles which are sort of juggling the mind. That is, liking and disliking, or grasping and attempting to acquire on the one side, and on the other side, rejecting, turning away, becoming afraid, or becoming hostile, attempting to eliminate. And so the mind swings between what is called in the sutta abhijja domanassa, these unwholesome states. Abhijja is longing, craving, yearning, and domanassa is discontent, sadness, disappointment, dejection. And so this arises because we let the mind flow out through the senses. So what is meant by restraining the senses? In the time of the Buddha, there were some Brahmins and other ascetics who would teach to restrain the senses means one doesn't see, doesn't hear. Of course, well, it's pretty hard to stop smelling, tasting, and touching things. But one tries to cover up the senses, or always to be looking down, and to avoid contact with sense objects. But that's not the way of controlling the senses or restraining the senses in the Buddha's teaching. What the Buddha says is that one does not grasp upon the nimitta, the sign of things, and does not grasp upon the detailed features of things. That is, when we grasp upon the sign, means that we sort of project inside some kind of label or designation upon the objects we encounter, that this is something I like, this is something beautiful, this is something agreeable, this is something threatening, this is something disagreeable. And so we first project a label, a designation, a general characteristic, and then the second stage is we start exploring the details or the features. So, for example, we have the young monk going on alms round in the village. So he looks up at the house where he stops, and there's a very pretty girl standing there, maybe with a bowl of rice and some vegetable dishes to offer. So first there comes the grasping of the impression, pretty girl. Then the eyes, without the restraint of the senses, the eyes start roaming. Ah, nice black hair, tied up in a bun on the top, or maybe ponytail, is that what you call it? Or braids, and oh, what a sweet smile, and that sparkle in her eyes, blue eyes, brown eyes, and looking down, oh, nice feet, nice dress. So the mind starts dwelling on the details. And then once the mind starts dwelling on the details, then these impressions remain sort of stored up in the mind, and then they come sort of thrown up again, and the mind starts elaborating and building up stories. Okay, so what one does in restraining the senses is tries to just stop with the bare impression. Of course, when dealing with things in the world, we're not going to close the eyes, but don't let the mind build up castles and imaginary constructions on the basic impressions that come in through the senses. So this is what the Buddha calls not grasping upon the signs or features, but not grasping upon the signs or characteristic, and not grasping upon the features. And so now one is able to interact with the world, but one doesn't let the world interact with oneself in the sense of getting a foothold in the deep recesses of one's own mind. And also this restraint of the senses, as one comes to understand the Buddha's teaching, one can see that it also has very subtle philosophical implications, because it's through building up thoughts on the basis of sense impressions that we start connecting these thoughts and then constructing philosophical theories about the nature of the things that we encounter in the world. But when we just stop at what comes through the senses without building up these fabrications or mental constructions, that we're then able to penetrate the real nature of phenomena and see things yatha bhutang as they really are. Okay, so now we've gone from contentment to restraint of the senses, and now we move towards the part of the bridge where the bridge is going over the water, so to speak. And this is the phase of the training which is called sati sampajanya, which is what we could translate as mindfulness and clear comprehension. And what's especially emphasized in this section of the sutta is maintaining clear comprehension in the midst of all activities. So the Buddha, when he's explaining how the monk trains in this particular phase of the practice, he says that the monk practices clear comprehension when going out and returning, when looking ahead or looking to the side, when bending or stretching the limbs, when putting on the robes and carrying the bowl, when eating, chewing, tasting, swallowing, drinking, even when going to the toilet, when urinating, defecating, and then in the midst of all activities, one has this mindfulness and clear comprehension. This is not yet the mindfulness which is used in what we might call an intensive or focused meditation practice, and not yet the clear comprehension which will turn into penetrating insight. But this is being mindful or aware of whatever one is doing and having a clear comprehension first of the purpose of one's activity. Before one undertakes any activity, one decides, is this activity really purposeful, meaningful, beneficial? And if we apply this, to our everyday lives, well, if I were an American citizen, I might get evicted from the country with my visa canceled and told not to return here because global capitalism comes crashing down. But we could use this principle of clear comprehension of purpose to think, what do we really need in our lives? Do we really need this? Do we really need that? And also with the monk's life, when we reflect on the purpose of our activities, we could cut down on a lot of extraneous activities. Okay, and then maintaining not only the awareness of the purpose of the activity, but when one is engaged in the activity itself, one maintains one's mindfulness established on the activity. So when one is walking, one is aware of walking. When one is looking, one is aware that one is looking. Whatever one is doing, one maintains a clear awareness of what one is doing. And this is training the mind. You can see it's building up that potential for samadhi, for concentration, because one keeps the mind on whatever one is doing. And sometimes this is very, very helpful to practice, even in one's everyday life. What I find to be very, very helpful, like when one has taking a walk, the way to set up clear comprehension is just to be mindful of every step that one is taking. The touch of the step against if it's outside the sidewalk, left, right, left, right, left, right. I remember years ago, this was in the 1990s, when I was living in Sri Lanka, but occasionally I would come back to Long Island to visit my parents. And in those days, people were much less tolerant than they are now of people who dress strangely and look strange. And so I would like to take walks around the neighborhood where my parents were living. But when I would go for a walk, it wouldn't be the people out on the street, but usually it would be the people in the cars that are driving by that would be calling out, "Hey, why don't you dress like a human being?" Or, "Hey, why don't you get normal?" One time, actually this was in the 1980s, during the time of the Iran hostage crisis. "Go back to Iran, we don't want you here." Another time, we're walking, "Is that a guy or a dame? A guy or a dame?" So what I would do, this is a sort of game that is going on. If they're driving by and they shout something abusive out, and I look up, they win, I lose. But if I just keep mindful of my steps, left step, right step, left step, right step, and don't look up, they shout out, I don't look up, I win, they lose. So maybe that's not so useful, or not so necessary for the people in the front row, but for you foreign monks from other countries, don't just stay in your temple, go for walks in your neighborhood. But if you're going to win in the battle against drivers going by, just be aware, right step, left step, right step, left step. And one time I was on the walk, and I was walking by, right step, left step, right step, left step. A car came driving by, and it started to slow down. And I thought, uh-oh. Just be aware. Left step, right step, left step, right step. Okay, build up loving kindness. May he be well, may he be happy, may he be well, may he be happy. The car is slowing down, slowing down, slowing down. Pulls up ahead, the car stops. Uh-oh, what do I do? Okay, I'm not going to turn around and walk away. I'm going to be courageous. Just go and set up loving kindness. So come walking, but getting afraid. Because some of these people are tough. And then finally I could see the guy standing there, corner of my field of vision. So I look up, and there's a man standing there like this. He looks like East Asian features. He says, "Venerable Sir, can I give you a ride someplace?" And then he says, "I'm a Thai Buddhist." And so I told him no, that I'm just taking a walk in the neighborhood. Okay, so this is mindfulness and clear comprehension. And so now one is developing this steady mindfulness, which is, in a sense, the seed of concentration, and clear comprehension, which is becoming the seed of insight or wisdom. But for these factors to become strengthened, then one needs the deliberate effort in what we now call formal meditation practice. And this, in this sequence of the gradual training, starts off, the Buddha says, when the monk goes off into seclusion. And then the Buddha mentions a number of places which are especially favorable to meditation. One goes to the forest, to the foot of a tree, to an open space. He mentions things like a ravine, a glen, a cemetery, or a deserted or a quiet hut. So one chooses a secluded place, and there begins the real effort at deliberately and intentionally training the mind. And this phase in the graduated training now brings us into the, I call this the struggle or the effort to deal with the major obstacles to the collection or concentrating of the mind. These are laid out in the scheme which is called the Panchanivarana, that is the 5 mental hindrances. And so the sutta passage says that one first has to overcome longing or yearning, which represents sensual desire. And so the disciple rids the mind of yearning or longing and dwells with a mind which is freed from longing. Then one overcomes or has to deal with ill will. This is anger, aversion, irritation, dislike. And so one has to free the mind from ill will. Then one has to overcome tinamida, dullness and drowsiness, sometimes rendered sloth and torpor. So this is the heavy, dull quality of mind. Something like when the weather turns, when the sky is gray and heavy, that kind of state of mind. Then comes the 4th hindrance, restlessness and remorse. And then comes doubt, in this case, doubt about the teaching, doubt about the practice. So this is set out in the formula of the gradual training, set out very concisely, as though an overcome sits down and just eliminates the 5 hindrances just at one sitting. But rather this is usually a gradual, long-term process of recognizing each of these 5 hindrances within oneself, learning the appropriate antidotes to each of the hindrances. Sometimes the antidote is just to continue focusing on one's main primary meditation object. Sometimes one has to use particular strategies to deal with each of these hindrances. Particularly for sensual desire, what's recommended is the meditation on the unattractive nature of the body, the different parts of the body, usually the 32 parts of the body. And for ill will or anger, the meditation on loving kindness. Okay, now with the overcoming of the 5 hindrances, it's said in the sutta that joy arises in the mind, and as joy arises in the mind settles down and becomes clear, and now the disciple is going to enter into the jhanas, the 4 meditative absorptions. And now here I have to take a little bit of a detour in the graduated sequence, because the question sometimes comes up, are the jhanas necessary for the practice of insight? Or can any of the stages of awakening or of realization be achieved without the jhanas, or are the jhanas absolutely necessary? And now we have to see that if one looks at the statement of the graduated training, we always find the 4 jhanas are included. And from this, if one just takes the graduated training as one's model, one would come to the conclusion the jhanas are absolutely necessary. But we have to realize that what the Buddha is laying out in the graduated training is what we can call a more complete, the most complete or most comprehensive version of the path. The version which is going to culminate in the final fruition of the path, which is the attainment of arhatship, the fruit of arhatship. And so because the Buddha is laying out the most complete version of the path, he will include the jhanas. But from my own investigation of the suttas throughout the 4 Nikayas, pretty much a tentative conclusion that I've come to is that there are different approaches for different disciples depending upon their aptitudes, inclinations, tendencies, particular strengths. And so we find that there's an approach that works with emphasis upon the direct development of insight, with only a minimal development of samadhi or concentration. And then there's an approach which uses even stronger degrees of samadhi or concentration than the 4 jhanas. And so the conclusion that I've seen is that it's possible to achieve the first and second stages of realization. In fact, the Buddha had many lay disciples who, from the suttas, it doesn't seem that they were jhana meditators, like Anathapindika, Visakha, who were busy householders, and yet reached the stages of stream entry once returning. And so it seems at the stage where the practice of jhana really becomes important, I don't want to say indispensable, but at least it plays a major role, is in making the transition from the second level of realization, the stage of once returning, to the third level of realization, the stage of non-returning. Okay, but in this presentation of the gradual training, ending in arhatship, the Buddha is going to include all 4 jhanas. And each of the jhanas has its own particular formula, which is laid out in the suttas. If you want to see the full formula, you can look at the second discourse in the Digha Nikaya, or many of the discourses in the Majjhima Nikaya. And this particular sequence that the Buddha is laying out here actually reflects the process that the Buddha himself went through on the night of his enlightenment. The Buddha explains that on the night of his enlightenment, he himself first passed through the 4 jhanas before developing insight and before attaining realization. And so we have each of the 4 jhanas is laid out with its own particular formula, and each has a particular simile to illustrate it. The similes are very, very beautiful. Okay, for the first jhana, it's illustrated by the simile of a bathing attendant, or today we might say a barber in the old barber shops, where when somebody goes in for a shave, the barber prepares the ball of soap. So he takes flakes of soap and puts them into a dish, and then sprinkles water in and mixes the soap and water together so that the soap and the water become perfectly blended together. So the water pervades all of the soap, and there are no flakes of soap left that are not pervaded by water. So this illustrates how this joy and bliss of the first jhana pervade the whole body of the meditator. Okay, but the first jhana has still what is called vitakka and vichara, which can be translated imperfectly as thought and examination. And these are considered to be relatively coarse factors because they involve some degree of mental activity. And that mental activity inhibits or clouds or disturbs to some extent the purity of the mind or the strength of concentration. So in order to further develop the samadhi or concentration, the meditator has to eliminate vitakka and vichara, thought and examination. And how this is done is not explained in the sutta itself, but the way it comes to be explained in other suttas and in the commentaries, that the meditator then reflects upon vitakka and vichara and sees that they are relatively coarse factors. And beyond this first jhana, there is another state which is more peaceful, purer, with stronger concentration. And then one makes the effort to develop the faculties further until at a certain point, thought and examination drop away, and then the meditator enters into the second jhana, which is free of thought and examination, but still has joy and bliss, which are now said to be born of concentration, born of this samadhi. Okay, and then the second jhana is illustrated by the simile of a mountain lake. A lake which is in a quiet, secluded mountain at the base of a mountain, and the water is swelling up from deep at the bottom of the lake and swelling up and filling that lake with cool, refreshing water. So this is the way the joy and bliss of the second jhana rise up and pervade the entire body of the meditator. Okay, but in the second jhana, there are these two factors of joy and bliss. And it seems when one first attains them that this is a really wonderful, uplifting, sublime state. But when one looks deeply into that state, one finds that the joy also involves an element of disturbance, because joy brings along a kind of exhilaration, a kind of upliftment of the mind, which is tinged a little bit with excitement. And so that disturbs the quietude of the mind, the serenity of the mind. And one realizes that beyond the second jhana, there is another state in which joy has vanished, but the bliss remains untarnished by that exhilaration of joy. And that is the third jhana. And so one makes the effort, and when the faculties are mature, then one enters into the third jhana, in which joy or rapture, piti, is now absent, but the sukha, the bliss or the pleasant feeling or the happiness, is now present with an element of mindfulness and clear comprehension becoming stronger, and with equanimity starting to become more prominent. And then this is illustrated in the simile by the example of lotus flowers, which grow in a pond, under the pond, so they never emerge to the top of the pond, so that every aspect of that lotus flower, the roots, the stem, and the petals themselves, the leaves and the petals, are covered and pervaded by this cool, refreshing water. And so in the same way, it's as if this pure bliss of the meditative absorption is now covering and pervading the body of the meditator. Okay, but as one examines that blissful state of the third jhana, one sees that even the blissful feeling is to some extent a little bit disturbing, because there's a tendency for attachment and clinging to arise in relation to blissful feeling. And so the meditator now realizes and understands that beyond the third jhana, there is a state which is called the fourth jhana, in which the feeling of bliss has dropped away and is replaced by a neutral feeling, a feeling which is called a dukkha sukha vedana, a feeling which is neither painful nor pleasant, a neutral feeling, a perfectly serene feeling. And so the meditator now makes the effort, and when the faculties mature, the meditator will enter into the fourth jhana, in which there is that neutral feeling which is neither pleasant nor painful, and now equanimity and mindfulness come to full maturity. And this fourth jhana is illustrated in the sutta by the simile of a man who is sitting with his whole body covered with a pure white cloth, a clean white cloth. So in this way, that pure, serene feeling of neither of equanimity, of neutral feeling, of the fourth jhana is now enveloping the whole body of the practitioner. Okay, so this takes us through the section on the gradual training of the path to liberation, which involves the development of samadhi. And now usually the path is laid out in terms of three major groupings: sila, virtuous behavior, samadhi, and then wisdom or insight. But in the fuller presentation of the path to liberation, sometimes some additional special knowledges are inserted before the cultivation of the higher wisdom. In the version of the Digha Nikaya, 8 higher wisdoms, 8 types of higher knowledge are laid out. But in the simpler version of the Majjhima Nikaya, 3 types of higher wisdom are laid out. And I'm getting a little tired, so I'm not going to take the 8 types. But I'll just mention the 3 types, which are what the Buddha himself explains in relation to his own enlightenment, and in the Majjhima Nikaya version in relation to the practice of the disciple. So the first of these is the recollection of one's own past lives. And so once one achieves and masters the 4 jhanas, now the mind has been brought to a state of deep stillness and powerful concentration. So the mind is now like a kind of powerful telescope. It's like the Hubble telescope, which is now, is far superior. And we're in California. We have the Mount Wilson telescope here. In Southern California, Mount Palomar. But those telescopes, their capacity for vision is obscured because the sky is filled with smog and clouds and moisture. But now we have the Hubble telescope floating beyond the Earth's atmosphere, able to focus on distant galaxies, galaxies beyond galaxies beyond galaxies. So this is like a mind now which has been trained in the 4th jhana. It's now beyond the smog, moisture, smoke of a mind which is clouded by the 5 hindrances and even by the factors of the 3 lower jhanas. So now one can look back and start recalling 1 past life, 2 past lives, even it said dozens and hundreds and thousands of past lives. Even one could recollect not only this cosmic aeon, but lives in previous cosmic aeons, going back past, using the terminology of present cosmology. We go back past the Big Bang, which brought into present this particular universe. We go back to earlier universes before this Big Bang, and then we get to that Big Bang, and go back, bang, 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 bang. And so now one is recollecting many, many of these past lives. And sometimes the question comes up, what use is it to recollect one's past lives? What relevance does it have to this path to liberation? Okay, first we raise the question, what is the path to liberation leading to liberation from? Basically, it's liberation from samsara, from the round of repeated birth and death. And so according to the Buddha's teaching, not only the Buddha's teaching, but the general teaching of the Indian spiritual systems of that period, all of us have gone through countless previous lives in which we've been born, grown old, fallen sick, and died. And so even when we're told that we have to go through this one time in this life, we might think, oh, that's terrible. But now if you start going back through previous lives and think, okay, that life I was born, I was a little infant, the carriage, then my mommy brought the bottle, I had to be trained with the bottle, then mommy took me to the toilet trained me, then comes the first day of kindergarten, then comes elementary school, junior high, high school, fights, have to fill out college applications, then you get your college degree, look for a job, want to travel, have to apply for a visa. 1 life, 2 lives, 3 lives, 4 lives, dozens of lives. Oh, this is tiring. I don't want to do it anymore. Okay, so then there comes, as one is recollecting the past lives, there comes a sense of, you get your college degree, you get a good job, fall in love, get married, have children, marital quarrels, children not doing what one wants, children grow up, go their own way, one falls grows old, falls sick, dies, then back to the mother's womb, maybe in the human world. And if one did bad deeds, maybe it's coming out and going, woof, woof. Or coming out and going, meow, meow. Or coming out and going, roar. A lion or a bear. And if you did really bad deeds, down to lower realms. Or if you get up into the heavens, then you are experiencing joy, delight, bliss of the heavens. Then the alarm clock rings and time to leave. And then they take you and bring you to the exit, kick you out, and then it's down again. Okay, so you're recollecting the previous lives. That's the first knowledge that arises. Then comes the second knowledge, which is the divine eye, through which one can see how beings pass away and take rebirth in accordance with their karma. And so now with the divine eye, one could shed the kind of light of vision. So just as now I can look out and see maybe many people in this room, with the divine eye, one could sort of, it's like looking at, or you look at a computer screen, you see people engaging in various activities on the computer screen. With the divine eye, you can look out and you see these are good beings who are behaving well by body, speech, and mind. They pass away and take rebirth in happy realms of existence. And you see the beings who do bad deeds of body, speech, and mind passing away and taking rebirth in realms of misery. And so now one is understanding and seeing into the working of the law of karma, and how this law of karma extends throughout all the realms of existence. And so now one is understanding the dynamics that lie behind the cycle of birth and death. So this is the second higher knowledge that arises. But now the Buddha speaks about the third higher knowledge, which is the actual knowledge that leads to liberation. And in the suttas, this is called asava kaya jnana, the knowledge of the destruction of the asavas. And what are the asavas? The word asava means that which flows. Generally, it's taken that the direction of the flow is inward. That which flows into the mind, or we could say that which flows up from the deep recesses, the deep inner strata of the mind, flows up into active consciousness. And these are sort of the deep underlying springs that maintain bondage to the cycle of birth and death. So the early suttas mention 3 asavas, 3 flowing defilements. First there is kamasava, which is the flowing defilement or the flux of sensual craving. Then there's bhavasava, the flux or flowing of the craving for continued existence, the attachment to continued existence. And then the deepest asava of all, sort of the villain of the piece, that which is underlying the whole play of samsara, is the asava of avijja, of ignorance, of not understanding things as they really are. And so the third higher knowledge is the knowledge which is directed towards uprooting, eliminating the 3 asavas. And since ignorance is at the base of all the asavas, what is needed to eradicate ignorance is wisdom, knowledge, insight into the ultimate truths, which, as the Buddha explains, is the knowledge of the 4 Noble Truths. And this takes place through the sequential development of insight until the insight knowledges emerge, seeing things as impermanent, suffering, non-self, selfless. And when these insight knowledges mature, then they culminate in what comes to be called the knowledge, the supramundane or world-transcending knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, which is actually the direct cognition of the third noble truth, the truth of Nibbana as the cessation of suffering. But when Nibbana is penetrated, then all Four Noble Truths are simultaneously penetrated. And so in the sutta, this is set out, it's not laid out in terms of the four paths and fruits, stream entry, once returning, non-returning, arhatship. But this is a kind of compressed teaching. So it's laid out only with respect to the fourth or final attainment. So it's said that the disciple is now seeing as it really is, this is the noble truth of suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the path to the end of suffering. And one sees these are the asavas, these are the underlying defilements. This is the origin of the defilements. This is the cessation of the defilements. This is the way to the cessation of the defilements. And then as one is knowing and seeing this, it said, the mind becomes freed from the taint or the asava of sensual craving, freed from the asava of craving for existence, freed from the asava of ignorance. And then with the liberation of the mind from these three asavas, these three flowing defilements, there comes a kind of retrospective knowledge or confirming knowledge. One understands that the cycle of rebirths is now finished and over, that the holy life, the spiritual life, has been done. What had to be done, that is the task laid down by the teaching, has been completed, and that there is nothing further beyond this. And that is the ending or goal, the realization of the goal of the path to liberation in early Buddhism. And so if you look through the suttas of the Digha Nikaya, you'll see first this path, the graduated path, is laid down fully in the Discourse on the Fruits of Recluseship, Sutta number 2. Now in the old days, when the suttas used to be recited from memory, probably the reciters would recite the whole sequence of the path in regard to each sutta. But in printed editions of the books, the sequence is usually abridged. I peeked ahead in the version of the Digha Nikaya that was handed out this morning, and I saw that for the later suttas of the Digha Nikaya, it starts off only with the first sentence, I think, of the sequence and the last sentence. So everything else that comes in between is just abridged. But when we come across this abridgment, we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that presentation, because in each of these suttas, the Buddha is laying out the same sequence. The only thing that's changing is the particular context under which it's laid down. Okay, I don't have a clock here.
7:39.
Okay, should we take a few questions? Sometimes that is rather risky with a very large group. But we'll try taking a few questions, if that will work.
First, may I thank you for your superb presentation. That was really beautiful. And on behalf of Light of Buddha Dharma Foundation, thank you so much. And it would be great to have questions. Probably the best thing would be if people wish to ask questions, they come here to the microphone. Then we can hear your question as well as Bhante's answers. So I could begin perhaps by requesting you, where in the canon is the description of the Night of the Enlightenment? Which sutta describes that fully?
Okay, one comes across one description of it in Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 4. This is called Bhaya-Bhairava Sutta, the discourse on fear and dread. And then the Buddha gives basically the same account, which again in the Majjhima Nikaya will be abridged in Sutta number 19. This is a discourse on the two kinds of thought, where the Buddha explains how in the period before his enlightenment, he distinguished his thoughts into two categories: the unwholesome thoughts, which are thoughts of sensuality, thoughts of ill will, thoughts of harming, and then the wholesome thoughts, thoughts of non-sensuality, thoughts of non-ill will, thoughts of non-harming. Okay, and then after explaining how he divided his thoughts in that way, then he explains how he proceeded from the purification of thoughts into the 4 jhanas and then the 3 higher knowledges. And then we come to a fuller account of the Buddha's whole struggle for enlightenment in Sutta number 36 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is a discourse that the Buddha gave to a sophist by the name of Satyaka, in which the Buddha speaks about his ascetic practices and some of the strange types of meditation that he did before he found the path to enlightenment. And it's in that sutta that the Buddha speaks about his experience in childhood during the time of a plowing festival, when his father, he was just a little boy then, so his father put him under a tree, and while he sat there unattended, while his father went off to lead the plowing festival, he spontaneously entered into the jhanas. And so now he recollects that childhood experience, and he thinks, could that be the path to enlightenment? And then he realizes that since he's been undertaking these fasts and all these very debilitating practices, that he can't attain the jhanas with an emaciated body. So now he makes the decision to resume taking normal food, and then he regains his strength. Then he enters into the 4 jhanas, and then acquires the 3 higher knowledges.
Thank you, Bhante. Are there questions? Yes.
Hi, Bhante, it's good to see you.
Oh, actually, that's Alan.
Yeah. Grew up here today. But my question is relevant to, it flows from the last question and also from the first thing that you said, which is you were distinguishing between the Upanishadic or Brahmanic tradition and the Buddha's understanding.
Yeah.
And what you were distinguishing was between Atman and Anatman, right?
Yeah.
So whose lives were recollected when he developed the wisdom of the recollection of past lives?
Yeah. Okay, this is a good point. Okay, now we have to get into a little philosophical territory.
Good.
Okay. It's often said that the teaching of anatta is said to be the teaching that there is no self. Okay, I don't understand it in that way. I understand it as the teaching, how to put it, the teaching that all the constituents of individual identity are non-self, are not to be taken as a self. And so the teaching of non-self does not deny or undermine the reality of personal identity. But personal identity is established not through a substantial core of an unchanging essence, which remains ever the same, but rather personal identity is established through continuity, through the sequence of, as a process or a sequence of ever-changing states of experience which are connected by principles of causal continuity or causal conditioning. And so an individual in any one particular existence is the product or a result of the actions performed and the karma generated by the individual in previous existence. And so while there is no Atman or self which is migrating from life to life while remaining ever the same, there is the continuity of personal identity maintained through the flow of consciousness, the underlying stratum of consciousness, which is ever changing, but which preserves the impressions of previous experiences and which preserves the karmic potentials generated by previous decisions and actions.
So it's the continuity of the sense of identity that's based on causes and effects of one's actions in the past.
I'd say it's the continuity of personal identity, not only of the sense of personal identity, because for most of us, we don't have the sense of personal identity of past lives because we don't have the recollection of past lives. But it is the actual continuity which is established, or it's the actual continuity of personal identity which is established through the continuous flow of consciousness from one life to the next, with its experiences in one life partly conditioned by its actions and experiences in the previous lives.
Thank you.
Thank you, Venerable, for giving a really great speech. I'm waiting, dying to hear your speech, and today I'm really happy and grateful for your teachings. I only have one question when I read the Tipitaka thoroughly, and these words always come to my mind that it was refer about the pariyati, patipati, pativeda.
Yeah.
And to me, that why I encourage my kids and myself to believe pariyati is come for us to guide. For me, I believe this is my guidance.
Yeah.
And just I rarely to hear how these teachings relative for us to continue in this practice, because we hear more and more about the practice, but I don't really quite understand the relationship between these teachings, more teaching, how much learnings we should learn, because it have Vinaya, it have Abhidhamma. There's so much for me that I have to learn.
To practice, one doesn't really have to learn a terribly large amount of things. First, one has to determine one's own situation and see what can one practice within one's own life situations, what particular teachings are relevant to oneself. And what I've laid out here this evening is the Buddha's like full path of liberation, or at least an outline as it's given for monastics. But when we look at the Pali Canon, we don't find that the Buddha is teaching only monastics, but often he teaches householders. And my own suspicion is that, because the Buddha traveled for 45 years over, through the towns and villages of northeast India, and whenever he would come, he would be speaking in villages and towns. So he must have given many, many more teachings to householders, which were not preserved because it would have been just too much material. And so, for householders, always what I recommend is the important teaching to begin with is a very, very beautiful sutta which comes in the third part of the Digha Nikaya. And you don't have to wait 3 years to hear it recited in order to be able to read it. It's called the Sigalovada Sutta, the discourse of advice to Sigala, who is a young man, on how a layperson should live according to in the appropriate way to fulfill the basic duties of a lay disciple. And so here he lays out first various numerical schemes, then it all condenses upon a scheme of generally 5 or 6 duties which a person should fulfill in relation to 6 other types of people. There's the relationship between parents and children, how parents and children should relate to each other, then the relationship of husband and wife, how they should treat each other, the relationship between friend and friend, relationship between employer and employees,
Servants. Teachers.
There were 6, right? Parents and children, husband and wife, employer, that comes last. Husband and wife, employer and employee. Did I mention teacher and student? No, okay. Teachers and students, and that's within the secular field, not the religious teaching. Then the last one is, and the Buddha's here very comprehensive because he's teaching in India. He says samana brahmana, so ascetics and Brahmins. He doesn't say bhikkhus and upasikas, but because he's speaking to people who will have contact with ascetics and Brahmins from all of the different traditions. Okay, so that is the general conduct for the household life. And if one wants to learn the basic, most fundamental teachings, I don't like to sound my own trumpet, to blow my own trumpet, but I tried to collect an anthology, or compile an anthology, to get all of the essential teachings in one volume. This was published by Wisdom Publications. They asked me to put together a book of 200 pages. But when I was putting it together, I thought, no, I can't leave this sutta out, can't leave that one out. So it came out to about 400 pages.
That's why I think I must be inspired by you about learning.
Yeah.
Because I just keep reading your books, and I think you just read a lot. And that's why I asked that question, because I think I'm inspired by that also. That it just seemed to be non-stop learning and reading.
Yeah, so with that book, you get, at least in one volume, the essential teachings put in a kind of systematic formula or layout.
Thank you, Venerable.
Yeah.
When the Buddha is teaching Rahula about how to remove the asavas, he brings up the 5 skandhas.
Yeah.
And of course, the remedy is connected with mindfulness.
Yeah.
But in a practical sense, where do we apply our minds? Where is the mind? What are we supposed to be putting our effort into in order to see these skandhas in our own practical experience?
Okay, generally to focus in on the khandha, I use the Pali term, the khandhas, or the Sanskrit is the skandhas. To focus in upon them individually is rather difficult to do in day-to-day life. So the Buddha has a scheme laid out within the 4 satipatthanas. And so one begins, this is within the systematic framework of meditation practice. Usually one begins with mindfulness of the body, some exercise in mindfulness of the body. This would include like mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness of the postures, mindfulness of the parts of the body, mindfulness of the elements. And so first one comes to learn to explore the body. And in this way one is already starting to get acquainted with the Rupa Khanda. Then one becomes acquainted with the next foundation of mindfulness, which is feeling. And so now one is starting to attend to the different feelings. And so now one is getting more acquainted with the feeling aspect of experience. So this is bringing the khanda of, or skanda of Vedana, of feeling, prominence. Okay, the third foundation of mindfulness is called Chittanupassana, contemplation of mind. But when one is contemplating the mind, one is really identifying the states of mind by their associated factors. So now one is starting to get acquainted with the various volitional tendencies within the mind. And now these 3 foundations of mindfulness are building up and leading into the 4th foundation of mindfulness. And one finds the contemplation of the 5 aggregates comes actually within the 4th foundation of mindfulness, which is called Dhammanupassana, contemplation of phenomena. Or maybe even leave the Pali or Sanskrit word dhammas or dharmas. Okay, so as one moves into contemplation of the dhammas, then it becomes easier to focus on the 5 aggregates individually, so that one could just, because the mind is, through the previous foundations, the mind is building up a capacity of, or strength of samadhi, and of mindfulness and concentration together. So now one could focus in on a particular aggregate, a particular skanda. So one could make the determination just to focus in on the Rupa Khanda, and then the mind will just pick up what is going on, even at very subtle levels of Rupa, how the phenomena of Rupa are arising and passing away. Then one can focus in on Vedana, what is happening in feelings, and now observing the feelings arising and passing away. And then focusing in on sanya, on perception, or cognition, and now seeing the perceptions arising and passing away. Then focusing in on the sankhara khanda, the volitional factors, seeing them arising and passing away. And then moving into the subtlest level of all, which is the vijnana khanda, seeing how consciousness itself is arising and passing away. And so then that is bringing the direct insight knowledge into the 5 aggregates.
Bhante, so my question actually also relates to the Satipatthana Sutta. During your talk you said that the practice of mindfulness and sampajana in as it's presented in the Samannapala Sutta is not yet the refined mindfulness, right? And so my question really is just, do you think that the way the terms are used in the Samannapala Sutta can be equated or lined up next to the way the terms are used in the Satipatthana Sutta, or is there a kind of subtle difference there, and if so, could you say something about that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they are different factors. They are actually the same factors, so I would say that one should use the same terms to render them. It's just that in the practice of sati sampajanya, mindfulness and clear comprehension, that comes in the scheme of the early Digha Nikaya suttas, like the discourse on the fruits of recluseship. We have the practice of mindfulness and clear comprehension is clearly playing a very preliminary role, leading up, to the practice of overcoming the 5 hindrances and then moving into the jhanas. And then moving from the jhanas or samadhi into insight and then realization. Whereas in the Satipatthana Sutta, mindfulness and clear comprehension are being used within the context of what I would call a focused or intensive meditation practice, which is aimed, I would say here the stress, though it does include some aspect of samatha or samadhi meditation, but generally in the Satipatthana Sutta, the focus is more on insight, the emergence of insight. So there I would say sati and sampajanya sort of being mindfulness and clear comprehension are being harnessed, especially for the development of insight knowledge.
Thank you.
But if one renders them differently, then I would say that there's a risk that one is losing a sense of the continuity of the practice.
Thank you very much for your all the ideas that you presented. The tradition I grew up in terms of liberation and spiritual growth, had the paradox that there's something I am to do, but it is beyond me. The concept of grace.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, in this exposition that the Buddha gave, or his graduated steps, is there something like that? Something like grace, or an equivalent, or something like that?
It's an interesting question because one doesn't find explicitly anything like corresponding to the Christian concept of grace mentioned in this, at least not in this presentation of the gradual training. And I'm trying to think whether there's anything like that mentioned in the Pali Suttas. But what I would say would correspond, I'd say 2 things that could correspond to the Christian concept of grace. One goes back to the biography of the Buddha, where we see this in Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 26, where the Buddha, after his enlightenment, he's still residing in the vicinity of the Bodhi tree, reflecting over several weeks on the Dhamma that he's realized, and then thinking or pondering to himself, should I make an effort to teach this Dhamma? Then he starts reflecting on people in the world and sees that people in the world are in the grip of greed, hatred, delusion, so difficult to teach. No, just too much trouble. And here I have beautiful woodlands, and there's a village nearby, I can go on alms round, and if I get tired of that village, I can go to another place in the woods. So let me just hang out in the woods and no need to teach. Okay, then when the Buddha's mind is thinking in this way, then one of the deities from the high celestial realms, Brahma Sahampati, then comes down and appears in front of the Buddha and pleads with him and says, please, Bhante, there are beings with little dust in their eyes who are able to understand the Dhamma. Please go out and teach. And then the Buddha, now he sort of opens up his Buddha eyes and sort of looks out in the world and then sees that indeed that there are, many people are just blind and deluded, but there are some people who are capable of understanding the Dhamma. And then the Buddha makes the resolve, well, he accepts Brahma's request and he makes the resolve, okay, I will go out and teach. And then he starts his teaching mission. And so we can say that that decision that the Buddha makes to teach, and all of the effort that he makes going for 45 years to teach the Dhamma, is one angle that I would say corresponds to grace. But there's another angle which is not actually, I think, mentioned in the text, but it seems to come into the experience of just about all practitioners. And this is that as one starts to practice, one starts to feel like there's some kind of force there which is sort of supporting one, upholding one, and as long as one is really committed to the Dhamma with a sense of refuge, submission, dependence, devotion, that it's like being out on the sea in a sailboat, and you open the sail. You don't see the wind, but the wind is there and it's blowing your boat and carrying your boat from your takeoff point to the destination. So when you dedicate oneself to the Dhamma, there seems to be some force there. And this is what, when we recite, we say, Buddhanubhavena, Dhammanubhavena, Sanghanubhavena, Sadasoti Bhavantu Te. This is the word anubhava, which is, I would render it like, by the spiritual might of the Buddha, by the spiritual might of the Dhamma, by the spiritual might of the Sangha, may you be well. So it's that anubhava, the spiritual might, which seems to be coming down as a kind of great wave of grace from the Buddha Shakyamuni himself, maybe from past Buddhas who have passed away, the sustaining power of the Dhamma, sustaining power of the Aryan Sangha, the Noble Sangha, which is like invisible currents of electrons in the air, or the visible force of a wind, which is there. So when one makes that inner commitment, that power or force comes behind one.
Thank you.
Thank you for that talk. I think my question is very unsophisticated in comparison to the ones that preceded. But I'm very much a layperson, and my question is that you mentioned a neutral feeling. And it seems that if one reaches that, then one cannot justify, for instance, any special love or affection to certain people in one's lives. So one cannot, dedicate more love to one's family, for instance, than the rest of the world, because you have a neutral view of everything. I'm not sure if I understood it correctly.
I think it's good that you brought the question up, but there is a misunderstanding there. And I think that stems from the use of the English word feeling, which for us conveys the meaning of emotion. But the Pali word is more precise. The word is Vedana. I think it's the same in Sanskrit. The same Sanskrit word is the same. This means not something like emotion, but it's rather, I would call this the felt tone of an experience. So any experience, according to Buddhism, can be either pleasant, painful, or this feeling which is neither pleasant nor painful. And so in this particular state of meditative absorption, the fourth jhana, the feeling that is present is, or the felt tone is one which is neither pleasant nor painful. In other words, it's a very peaceful, neutral feeling. It doesn't mean that the person becomes emotionally dead, or that the person becomes like a robot who is or like a brain dead person, or a person who's in a permanent coma. But rather that within that state, the person is in, feels that experience as one which has neither pleasure nor pain within it. But when the person comes out, of course, if they're developed enough to enter into the four jhanas, they won't have a very clinging attachment and won't have, rough or disturbing emotions. Well, they could still have some disturbing emotions, but they'll be able to deal with them. But the person who is capable of developing the four jhanas can still have the feelings of what we call metta. This is loving kindness, feelings of compassion, feelings of concern for others, feelings of joy with others. So there's a whole range of wholesome emotions which are accessible to the person who can enter into those states.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a young man here.
Hello.
Okay.
So, first of all, if you remember, so in 2004 when you gave those talks, 2003 and 2004,
Yeah.
I listened to them on the computer, and two, I have the Majjhima Nikaya.
Yeah.
So, can I please have an autograph?
Yeah, I can order.
And I have the pen.
Okay, I don't have a pen. You've read the whole book? But you've listened to those talks? Wow. What is your age? Your age? You're 8 years old? Wow. And your name is? Neelam. N-I-L-A-M? N-E-E-L-I-M.
Dear Venerable, I'm sure we'd all like one of those. As you know, the Light of Buddha Dharma Foundation has been working for the last 10 years to rebuild the Buddha Sasana in India. And we've done this by sponsoring prayer ceremonies, by working at the places of pilgrimage, by printing books, to create the auspicious circumstances for the training of a new generation of monks. And our work has begun to spread into other countries. And it's particularly auspicious that you are here on the first night of our first Tipitaka chanting ceremony in America. Because as you know, the central theme of our work is the chanting of the Tipitaka, and you are a foremost authority. And I thank you so much for your talk tonight. It's been truly inspiring, comprehensive, really beautiful. Thank you, Bandit. And thank you for your patience. For many questions, I had to turn away questioners towards the end. But thank you again for being here.
Okay, at the end, first I'd like to dedicate the merit,
Of course.
first, since all of this has been organized and started and organized through the years through the vision, insight, initiative of Venerable Tartang Tulku Rinpoche, transmitted to giving the instructions to his daughter, Wangmo, who has been, are you Wangmo's husband?
I am.
So you have been the collaborator with the Light of the Buddha Dharma Foundation International. So first I would like to dedicate the merit of this talk and to all the activities that I participated in today to the good health and long life of Tartang Tulku Rinpoche. And I'd like to dedicate this merit also in New York City. There was a young man, well, about 30, in his 30s, who had been associated with the New York Buddhist Vihara, that's the Sri Lankan temple in Queens, New York. And I had met him on several occasions. And 2 days ago, I went to visit the monks at the New York Vihara before I took the flight out to California, and they told me that that young man in his 30s, his name was Jose, had died of cancer. And they told me that they were having a memorial service for him last night, and they invited me to come. But I said, I'm sorry that that yesterday afternoon I would have to fly out to California. But I told them that I will dedicate the merit of my chanting to Jose. And so in my mind now I share the merit of this chanting this afternoon and of the talk that I gave tonight to Jose. So Jose, wherever you are, please rejoice in these merits. And then usually when I end the talk, we share the merits with the Dharma protecting deities, the Nagas or dragon spirits, the Bhutas or fear spirits. So I'd like to end just by chanting some verses in Pali for the sharing of the merits. And those of you who know it, who know the verses, can chant along with me. Akasata cha bhumata devanaga mihitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata cha bhumata devanaga mihitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu te sanam. Akasata cha bhumata devanaga mihitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang param. Etavata cha amhehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cha amhehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cha amhehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Bhavagupadhaya avichihetato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha asanya sanyino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibbutting.
Thank you all for coming. That ends this evening, and we hope to see you all tomorrow. Thank you.